Let me know if it sounds okay online. Speak quite quietly. So, hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah. Nice to be here. Okay. I work in the HT2026. I'd love it to be really mostly on mental health. I think to be I'm part of a team that found that as well actually like action attention to that action and entering. David is say that it can first part of that. But then we will then move into the action only is of change of risk mental health. Look at how climate action, how wellbeing and emotional resilience climate action. So we'll look at emotions shape our action. Shape our emotion. I'm also going to give lots of examples in so to start off, and I was so the first question is, anything of climate change in my existential crisis, anxiety, overwhelm, yeah, stress, guilt about experiencing air pollution, stress and anger, connectedness, and more connection. A lot of these and the emotions and denial, anxiety. I'm going to do this and put in a bit of. So, first question is, what like experience each year between not have code then everyone for who can hear us online and trying. Can you hear me okay? Um, okay, well, got a mix of answers, mostly 84%, that is correct. Yeah, so 84% of the heat wave days which are being experienced each year over the last 5 years or so, which are life-threatening to physical health and to mental health, these would not have occurred without human-induced climate change. So this is really critical that climate change is driving more frequent and more severe extreme weather events and extreme heat. And this is having really big impacts on health and well-being. Air pollution is the second leading risk factor for early death around the world. Is this true or false? I think a lot of true. Um, so this is true. Air pollution is second only to high blood pressure as a leading cause of early death around the world. I promise we will get on to actions and solutions. It's not all going to be grim facts about climate and health. How many children are displaced due to weather-related disasters every day? Yeah, on average every day. So yes, the answer is 20,000. This is data from UNICEF that suggests that on average around the world, 20,000 children are being displaced because of climate-related, weather-related disasters every single day. And we'll come on to this a bit later about why displacement is such a crucial factor for health and well-being, and can be linked with a variety of physical health impacts, but also forced displacement is part of really disrupting the kinds of kind of social environmental conditions that are really important for mental health and for well-being. Okay, I think we have a few more of these. In 2024 alone, climate impacts disrupted school for how many children? 10 million, 90 million, or 240 million? This is for the year 2024. And it's also data from UNICEF. I'm sharing these stats too. And also action on disaster planning. Investing in Hopefully that will work. Okay, we're trying a different microphone. Hopefully this sound comes through better. Okay. So the sector with the highest return on investment from adaptation action is health. Okay. Thank you everyone for engaging with this. I'm gonna okay. Going to give a bit of an overview of some of the evidence around climate change and mental health. This is a research. I hear a weird echo. A research field that has been growing quite rapidly, particularly in the last few years, both in terms of understanding the impacts that climate change is having on mental health, but also the opportunities for action. So if you care about climate change and the energy transition, why does it matter to think about mental health and well-being? Health is a really important lever of climate action. Health, both physical and mental health and well-being, is the ultimate cost of the climate crisis, but it's also the ultimate benefit of action. It's the human experience of climate change. So when it comes to advocating for climate action, the health argument can be really powerful in driving policy action and driving investment. Well-being for everyone also reinforces reducing emissions. There is a really positive reinforcing cycle between higher well-being, higher trust, higher equity in societies with better governance and lower emissions. And psychological resilience is a really important foundation for driving the kinds of transformations that the climate crisis demands in our societies. It's a really important foundation of climate resilience, of being able to cope with the impacts of climate change and take collective, impactful action. And also the psychological well-being of people who are studying and working in climate change is also a really important area of attention. We hear so much in the climate cares team from students, from people who are working in these sectors, that people are turning away from studying these subjects. People are leaving these careers because of burnout and overwhelm. So ensuring that psychological resilience, of support for mental health and well-being is really embedded into working in climate change and taking climate action, climate activism is really critical. So mental health and well-being really matters if you care about climate change. Climate change also really matters if you care about mental health. Climate change is a risk multiplier for mental health. It often is a kind of compounder for existing things in societies which can drive poor mental health. And also it's the people who are often most marginalised and worst impacted in communities already who experience the worst impacts on mental health and well-being. So climate change widens existing inequities in societies. And the consequences of climate change on mental health is leading to a changing, growing health burden that health systems have to respond to. And there is, I think, no country in the world currently that can meet mental health need. So this is something which urgently needs attention anyway, and then climate change is a kind of compounder. So this is really undermining progress on health and equity. But also, we'll talk about how climate change is a risk multiplier for mental health, but climate action is an opportunity multiplier for mental health. Climate action can help foster the conditions for good mental health and well-being to thrive. We can kind of see this as a vicious cycle currently, where climate change worsens mental health and well-being through direct experiences of extreme weather events, through disrupting the conditions in communities that are really important for mental health and well-being to thrive, and also through emotional and psychological responses to learning about climate change, to witnessing and action. And these impacts that affect mental health can then undermine the capacity that we have as individuals, as communities, and also as systems to be able to cope with the impacts of climate change and take action. So I'm gonna, oh yeah, and here's the stat that we had on the Mentimeter that the cost of the additional mental health burden from climate change, air pollution and lack of green space each year is predicted to reach 537 billion by 2050. So this is something which is really important for our health, but also for economies. I'm going to unpack what this means in terms of some of the pathways through which climate change is impacting mental health, and then move on to the what we can do about it. So there's growing research which is highlighting kind of just how much this is impacting communities. It's estimated that for every 1 degree increase in temperature above a kind of normal level, there's a 1% increase in suicide. This is also something which people who live with mental health conditions can be face increasing risks during heat waves. They're sadly more likely to be hospitalised, more likely to die during a heat wave. And extreme temperatures are linked with a range of other emotional and mental health impacts, including increased gender-based violence and worsened kind of population mood, worsened what's called sentiment in communities. Extreme weather events also have been linked with a range of different mental health outcomes. Often when people kind of think about extreme weather events and what action is needed to help prevent impacts and respond to them, they think about the physical disruptions, but the psychological impacts from any form of disaster can exceed physical injury by 40 to 1. This picture is from a study in Australia that asked people who had experienced an extreme weather disaster what kind of symptoms they experienced in terms of mental health impacts. Nearly 3/4 talked about symptoms of anxiety, nearly half talked about symptoms of depression, over half had disrupted sleep. So these are really widespread impacts which can be also really long lasting. So it's not just something which is happening immediately after an extreme weather event, but can go on for years. This has been shown in the case of flooding. So something which is really important to highlight is that often, the extreme weather events aren't just happening as isolated events, they're happening as compounding crises. And people are living with either repeated events like repeated flooding or multiple different events happening at once. And repeated flooding, for example, has been linked with long-term mental health impacts, linked with flooding up to 5 years after that event took place. And also, particularly in the case of this happening in early childhood, can have really long-term impacts across a person's life course. As well as these direct consequences of climate change on mental health, climate change can also kind of undermine the conditions that are needed for mental health and wellbeing to thrive. That could be things like disrupting access to healthcare, disrupting education. This quote is from a project we did called Connecting Climate Minds, which brought people together in dialogues across research, across policy, across lived experience. And we held several dialogues with young people around the world to talk about the impacts that they were experiencing. This young person said that the impacts of climate change on our learning environment exacerbates existing mental health issues, limits possibilities, wellbeing, and educational capacity. Air pollution is also a factor which has a lot of influence on physical and mental health. And this is driven by burning of fossil fuels, as well as other factors such as like wildfire smokes, which is made worse by extreme heat. And this has been linked with things like increased suicide and depression, worse outcomes for people living with mental health conditions, and effects across people's life course. There's some evidence that suggests that being exposed to air pollution during pregnancy can impact the health and development of that child across their life course as well. So these are impacts that are not just being felt in this generation, but across future generations too. These are some more quotes from the study I mentioned, Connecting Climate Minds, which brought together people in dialogues. This farmer based in Kenya talked about how the harvest is going down every year, talked about a lot of depression, hopelessness, and a feeling of not knowing what to do, a lot of trauma. Many people talk about suicide and fatigue from farming connected to lack of sleep. And this quote kind of shows just how many different types of mental health impacts are often being experienced all at once. These impacts are also disproportionately felt by people who are often most marginalised already in communities, This quote talks about how women face kind of compounding impacts of reduced earnings, higher stress levels, compounding with caregiving responsibilities, and a vicious cycle also linking with increased domestic violence. There's also a range of different psychological responses to climate change. Many of you talked about this in the very first slide about feelings of guilt, fear, anxiety, grief, hopelessness, anger, denial, disengagement. These are all kind of responses that people hold to learning about climate change, to witnessing inaction. And it's really important to highlight that kind of feeling these things about climate change is a very kind of rational and healthy response to the climate crisis. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't require the right support to process and kind of explore those feelings and particularly channel them into collective climate action. What we hear particularly from young people is that young people don't want distress to be kind of taken away from them or invalidated in the context of climate change, but want to be heard, want to be meaningfully centered in climate action. And lots of these emotions like anger and distress can be really important motivators of taking climate action. And engaging in action, collective action can itself be really helpful for mental health and well-being. But then, as I mentioned earlier, can also have a risk of burnout and overwhelm without the right support. So there is a really important need to understand and support and validate the huge diversity of emotional responses that can come up in the context of climate change. This is a quote from a man talking about his country, Aruba, and I think really reflects a lot of these different emotional responses that can come up in the context of not just having an awareness of climate change, but also experiencing it firsthand. And he talked, yeah, I'll just give you a minute to read it. Okay, we're nearly there with the heavy stuff. This is often happening in the context of all of these different kind of pathways that I've been talking about, the direct impacts of extreme weather events and the disrupted conditions for good mental health and well-being, and also these psychological responses to kind of witnessing the impact of climate change. These are very kind of compounding, often happening all at once. And so this kind of paints often quite a kind of complex picture of then how to understand and respond to these impacts. And also, it's really important to put this in the context of many other multiple compounding crises that people are experiencing. Climate change is a kind of compounder of many of the crises which already are happening, is driven by many of these crises. And so putting it into this lens of what can be called like a poly crisis is really important for understanding that often there are kind of common causes and therefore kind of common actions that can be taken in this really complex picture. So finally, these are all impacts which can be felt really unequally in societies. It's often people who are already facing highest vulnerabilities or most marginalised who might be worst affected. So kind of understanding and responding to the links between climate and mental health has to consider who might be most at risk, but also not just exploring this from the lens of vulnerabilities, but also the lens of resilience and centering people who are worst affected in action to make sure that we're also learning from the unique experiences and resiliencies that people hold. And vulnerabilities can be linked to a whole range of things, whether it's to people with pre-existing health conditions, gender, ethnicity, occupation, so people who are kind of working in livelihoods that are really tied to the environment can be worst affected, age, life stage, and also where you live. Okay, it's a lot in terms of the impacts. Also, one final point on this to highlight is that a lot of the evidence around climate and mental health has historically been really biased. a lot of the data comes from high-income countries. A lot of the countries which are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change are where there are the biggest data gaps in terms of climate and mental health. So this is kind of something which is still a really big challenge in the field, but it is starting quickly to shift more and more as the kind of awareness and momentum builds. But there are many challenges around data, stigma around mental health, and so a lot of the data that I've been drawing on is kind of trying to represent how these experiences are being experienced across different countries, but just to highlight that this is still a really big problem in the space is this data bias. So if there's this vicious cycle between climate change and mental health, what does that mean in terms of action? What is possible? And how can we then see climate action as a really important motivator and co-benefit for mental health and wellbeing? Climate change can be seen, and certainly is, the biggest global health threat that the world faces, but it also can be a really important opportunity to redefine the social and environmental determinants of health. And something which we're kind of going to come on to now is like how what we need is not only just talk about the problems of climate change, but also really link this to the solutions and action, and to foster a vision that can feel really worth creating and worth fighting for, and imagine the world that we want to be part of and how we can create it. So from this vicious cycle that I've been describing, there's also then potential to move into a virtuous cycle. The actions that we can take for the state of our world can also be linked with the state of our mind. And there are many win-win actions that are possible across different sectors, which can benefit not only climate mitigation and climate adaptation, but also mental health and well-being. I mentioned at the beginning about this kind of reinforcing cycle between well-being and emissions. So just to show what this looks like in a bit more detail, this is taken from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it really highlights how fostering well-being and building equity, building trust is really linked with reducing emissions, driving better governance, driving better participation in climate action. And so there are these kind of really positive cycles which are possible. What does this mean in reality for how climate action can be an opportunity multiplier for mental health? Some of these actions across sectors can look like improving the energy efficiency of housing, making homes more affordable to heat in winter, safer during extreme heat, can also reduce kind of the physical and mental health burdens of living in homes which get too hot in summer and too cold in winter. More what's called active transport, so more cycling and more walking, not only really benefits can reducing emissions, but also improves physical and mental health, reduces air pollution, noise pollution. Green and blue spaces, this is particularly thinking about in cities. There's a really important role of trees and blue spaces like water, lakes to reduce temperature extremes, to reduce what's called the urban heat island effect, but also to build connection to nature and reduce stress and anxiety. And also build connection and kind of really strong communities. And having this comes back to the point at the beginning around psychological resilience being a really important factor kind of driving climate action. Having really strong relationships, strongly connected communities is a really important foundation for good mental health and well-being, but also for climate resilience. This is also one of the questions that was in the quiz at the beginning about the return on investment across different sectors. I'm sorry, it's really small. So this shows that adaptation action, which is really critical across all different sectors, can have huge returns on investment, huge cost savings, huge health benefits, and while this is really important across many sectors, where the biggest returns on investments can be achieved is in health. But as this slide shows, we need collective action across lots of different sectors in order to benefit health and to put these co-benefits for climate action and mental health action into reality. So these are some of the ways that climate action can benefit mental health, but also how we think, how we feel is really what drives how we act. So not only is this kind of link between climate action and mental health action important to be protecting mental health and well-being, but also to be driving climate action. So this is a quote from Brian Eno, who's a musician and climate activist, who talks about that we know the information, but information is not changing our minds. Most people make decisions on the basis of feelings, including the most important decisions in life. What football team you support, who you marry, what house you live in, that's how we make choices. Thought is at the basis of our feelings. And before we have ideas, we have feelings that lead to those ideas. So how do we change minds? A change in feelings changes minds. And so how we think and how we feel, that not only drives action, but also taking action, particularly kind of climate action that's done together with others, that's building kind of building things like agency and driving change, that also can change our emotions. So this is kind of coming back to some of the concepts that you shared at the beginning on kind of what came to your mind when you thought about the links between climate change and mental health. There are many different psychological responses that can lead to climate inaction or can lead to climate action. And some of these can be overwhelming and some of these can be underwhelming. So feelings like anxiety, grief, distress, these can be, all very powerful emotional responses, can be really challenging to cope with, and can lead to a state of overwhelm that ultimately drives inaction for climate change. But also feelings like denial, disengagement, this kind of sense of underwhelm can also lead to inaction. But both of these really are kind of psychological responses, which are, can be seen as defense mechanisms in trying to keep us safe in an unsafe climate, but ultimately is driving to a state of disconnection between how we feel and how we act. Other responses that can be really helpful in driving action can be emotions like hope, agency, feeling anger, feeling rage. These are all really important motivators of action. And by engaging in action, this can also itself not only help to kind of create the kind of action that supports mental health and well-being, but just by the act of being involved in things which particularly are collective action taken together with others, kind of building strong communities that can also support mental health and well-being, build agency. And so coming back to this quote from Brian Eno about a vision, that what we need is a vision that is kind of worth fighting for. And often when we talk about climate change, we talk about the problems and the challenges, which is really critical, but we need to also be kind of talking about that together with the solutions and what is possible, and solutions which we all can have kind of power to get involved in, to take action on, that feel kind of really connected to what we care about, the world that we want to see, and holding this tension between things being really challenging, but also seeing the future that we would all like to create and our roles in creating it. Okay, I want to give some more examples of some really positive action that's happening around the world to respond to the different kinds of impacts I spoke about, whether that's through extreme weather events, through disrupting the conditions that are needed for good mental health and well-being, and also the kind of psychological responses to climate change. Okay, so here are a range of different examples of work that's happening across different countries to respond to different parts of this kind of climate and mental health space. So vote for what one you'd most like to hear about, and I'll talk about that, but we can do multiple ones. The dots are actually very hard to count. I think we've got most votes for, oh yeah, I've got the numbers. Youth-led resilience building happening globally. So let's start with that one. There is really amazing work that's been happening around the world that's being led by young people. And to give a couple of examples, there's a wonderful project called the Resilience Project, which creates kind of peer support spaces for young people to build community, to share kind of how it feels to be living, studying, working in the climate crisis, and to collectively explore ways to kind of build resilience, to find ways to process different emotional responses. And this is work that's happening around the world. I think the Resilience Project has supported over 150,000 young people in over 50 countries by building these kind of peer learning and community building spaces. And it just shows the power of just creating a space to kind of come together and talk about how it feels to experience the climate crisis and collectively kind of channel that into action. There's also a really wonderful group called Force of Nature, who do a lot of work around kind of creating support and kind of like resources for young people to go and speak to people in business, to speak to people in policy, and really centre young people in climate action. They also do work on kind of advising educators on how to be teaching about climate change. And again, kind of create these spaces where young people can collectively explore and process how it feels to be living in the climate crisis. Again, this is something which is done in many, many countries around the world. Okay, let's do one more. I think air pollution and suicides in China. So I mentioned earlier around the links between air pollution and how this can affect a range of different mental health outcomes. It also is can be really harmful for physical health. But there is really amazing action that can be taken by reducing air pollution. And something which is really important is not only responding to these mental health impacts when they've happened, but also acting to prevent them from happening in the first place. There's a prevention and control an action plan in China that has managed to lead to really big reductions in air pollution. And between 2013 to 2017, it's estimated that this air pollution control program has reduced up to 80,000 suicides, which is 10% of all of the suicides that happened during that period. Yeah, this is a really important part of the kind of action in climate and mental health is how do we prevent these impacts from happening in the first place. I'll do one more. Supporting women smallholder farmers in Kenya. So people who are working in agriculture, particularly kind of smallholder farming, can be really at risk of course, kind of losing livelihoods, losing crops. And there is kind of a lot of growing kind of understanding around how the impacts on farming and agriculture can lead to really poor mental health outcomes, lead to suicides, as well as not being able to access enough food and a kind of financial impacts as well. There's a really amazing project happening in Kenya called AgriSycBeam, which is around supporting women smallholder farmers and creating kind of peer support spaces to kind of collectively talk about these experiences when kind of women who are working in smallholder farming are losing crops because of impacts like droughts or kind of compounding climate impacts, and then build collective resilience and kind of sharing solutions and just having spaces which can be really building community and connecting people who are experiencing mental health impacts with appropriate mental health support. And this is led by a woman who was a smallholder farmer in Kenya, and then after witnessing the mental health impacts that were being experienced in her community, retrained as a psychologist to be able to deliver this care in her community. Okay, I think let's stop there. But yeah, just really trying to share that this is just a very small handful of a huge number of amazing interventions that are happening around the world to respond to the different parts of these links between climate change and mental health. And there's there's a really kind of important need to better kind of share and talk about these stories of action and stories of really important change, as well as talking about the challenges. Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how this is all kind of being, how this is reaching kind of policy, and particularly in a global sense. So climate change and mental health has historically received a lot less attention than the physical health impacts of climate change. But this is something which has been growing more and more in the last few years. Progress is still really lagging behind the need, but it is growing. A couple of things which have happened really recently, which are really positive for climate action and mental health. At the UN climate conference at the end of last year, COP30, a health action plan for adaptation in the health sector was launched and endorsed by, I think, by 50 countries. And this is the first time any kind of global climate policy document has had really substantial content around mental health that sets out a whole bunch of actions around integrating mental health into climate adaptation actions, and seeing this as really central to what needs to happen in the health sector. There's also been progress around how we track adaptation globally. A really big part of the UN climate conference, COP30, was a global goal on adaptation, which aims to kind of measure progress across different sectors and across countries. And there is an indicator on mental health that has been included within that, which looks at the proportion of vulnerable people who have access to mental health support in the context of emergencies. So that's a really positive step of how this stuff is starting to kind of come into what is being prioritised, what is being called for, what is being measured, and also what is being invested in. But there is still a big gap. This is an image from a report that we did last year, which looked at how mental health is currently being included in national adaptation plans. So every country is kind of expected to have a plan, or is building a plan around adaptation to climate change across sectors. And we looked at how mental health and wellbeing is being included at the moment in these plans. And just under half, so 42%, had some mention of mental health at all, but only 36% explicitly mentioned how mental health is being impacted. And then only 17% mentioned any actions to then actually respond to the mental health impacts of climate change. So this is a pattern that's seen across a lot of climate policy spaces, that there's a gap between recognising the impacts, but then actually outlining and investing in actions to respond to them. Despite knowing that even when it's not making it into global policy, this work is already happening across different countries, and there are amazing interventions that can be learnt from, that can be scaled, that can be kind of put into these plans. So yeah, more work to go. Okay, and finally, I just wanted to speak a bit about what is happening in terms of the work that we do at Climate Cares and what we're doing at Oxford. I mentioned earlier this project called Connecting Climate Minds. So this was a project that brought together over 1,000 people in 126 countries, and basically kind of held dialogues that could bring people together across different research disciplines, across policy, across lived experience, across communities, to identify where are the gaps in evidence at the moment, and what evidence can most respond to what communities are experiencing, and also what decision makers need to act. We then, this is like, I say we, this is a really huge global team that led this project. We developed 10 agendas for research and action in climate change and mental health, including one in every in 7 different regions globally, and then also globally with young people, with Indigenous communities, and with smallholder farmers and fisher people. Also, part of this, we try to kind of build as many kind of stories and examples of existing action and things that are working really well to really share kind of stories of action and success. And also this work really kind of wanted to put people's lived experience at the centre of how climate and mental health research is done, how action is done. So we also gathered a quite large number of lived experience stories, which are videos of people talking about how their mental health is impacted. Yeah. So one of the outputs of this project is a hub, like an online platform, which shares all of these outputs, which shares these stories of impact, shares the stories of action, and aims to really kind of help build momentum and build awareness in the climate and mental health space. Another project that we're working on is around climate education. So this is a report that is being published now, maybe tomorrow, which looks at the views of students and educators in the UK around how young people are learning about climate change, and how to bring mental health and wellbeing and emotional resilience building more into this work, particularly in schools. And so that climate education is better supporting young people to be kind of building skills and tools to be living in a really uncertain world, and isn't just driving distress or driving disengagement with climate change. We also do a lot of work in policy, so really trying to get mental health integrated into climate policy spaces. And this has included kind of creating reports and doing analyses of policies like the map I shared a minute ago. We work on basically kind of creating a network of people working across government. So we work with maybe 15 different departments and agencies in the UK government to bring them together in these discussions about climate change and mental health, to see kind of where is there evidence that they need, what can best help drive action, and how we as researchers can help to fill the gap and where the evidence is. We've done things like creating courses for policymakers, and also go to climate policy spaces like the UN climate conferences to advocate for mental health. And we also do a lot of research. So some of the research we're doing at the moment, colleagues of mine are working with young people in the Philippines, in Australia and Trinidad and Tobago on co-creating research projects and co-creating interventions that looks at different psychological responses to climate change. And this work is also really basically trying to kind of connect young people into policy action, particularly in Australia. So getting policymakers, getting young people into the same room. So policymakers are really listening to and hopefully meaningfully acting on what young people want to see happen. I mentioned the Resilience Project earlier, this youth-led global network, which is building peer-to-peer community support spaces for young people. Something we hear a lot from policymakers is that there isn't enough evidence on what works, so we need more evaluation of existing interventions to be able to then invest in it more, to advocate for it more. So that's something that we're doing in kind of working together with youth-led groups to then kind of build data around what's working and why, to then take that data to governments and be like, okay, here's why it works and here's why we should invest in it more. And we're also doing work around kind of how climate change affects mental health. So the kind of, we know there are these links between, say, heat and mental health outcomes, but then like actually how is that happening is something that we're looking at as well. We just started a study which is in the US, which is working with young people who have experience of depression and anxiety, to see kind of what happens when people living with these conditions are under extreme heat. And what we're doing in that work is some other researchers are basically using what's called kind of heat chambers to see what happens when you follow people who are put into experiences of kind of extreme heat stress, and then seeing what happens in their bodies. What we're doing is the kind of lived experience advisory part of that project, so working with young people in the US to make sure that how that research is done is guided by the experiences and voices of people who are young people living in the US with depression and anxiety. Okay, so there's a lot on the impacts and also hopefully on the actions, and really trying to show that there is a lot of work which is happening around the world on this already. But really, in summary, where we are now can kind of feel like a vicious cycle where mental health and climate change are linked in this kind of way of climate change worsening mental health and well-being, and this limiting the capacity of communities and systems to be able to take climate action. But there is this opportunity to move from a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle, and to take action that can benefit not only climate mitigation, climate adaptation, but also mental health and well-being. And doing this requires really bringing together really diverse forms of knowledge, expertise, whether that's across research disciplines, across countries, across communities, and knowing that there's a lot out there already, which is kind of knowledge that is being held and already being done that can be learned from. We need to better monitor the mental health impacts of climate change. I talked about this data gap earlier, where often it's the places that are worst affected by climate change where we have the least data. And there is a lot of work that's required in that around how we talk about this. You know, I've been using language of climate change and mental health, but something that we hear so much in this work is that you know, the language that gets used in this field is language that is rooted in very Western constructs around mental health, around climate change, and that doesn't reflect the really diverse experiences and ways of conceptualizing, talking about mental health and well-being, and also around climate change. So when we talk about monitoring the mental health impacts of climate change and also the benefits of action, there's really important work that has to happen of what actually matters to measure. What does success look like? We need to be investing in communities and building psychosocial resilience, and really seeing this resilience not just as something which is physical, but something which is really human and something which is emotional, and putting kind of people at the heart of that resilience, and seeing that as the foundation for how we can cope with the impacts of climate change, and how we can also prevent this mental health burden. And a lot of this comes down to kind of awareness raising and action, and really putting health, both mental and physical health, at the centre of how we talk about climate action. So that is everything from my from the presentation bit. But I would love to hear from you and hear what's kind of resonated or not resonated, and also to hear what through Mentimeter, or if you have any questions about if this has kind of linked with things that you have already seen or heard about happening in the climate and mental health space, or other reflections that you want to share. So we can start with this, and then I would love to hear from you. Okay.
Hi. I think I work in and I think it's interesting. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's interesting how there is a connection between mental health and climate change, and how that's a multiplier. Climate change is a multiplier for mental health.
Mm.
And from my reflection is that I find a lot of young people are not very aware of the impact of climate change. And although they're going through poor mental health, they can't link it. So I think there should be more awareness. You rightly said there's a gap. We need to better monitor the mental health impact of climate change. How would you recommend we do that in our experience?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's something that we've heard a lot in our research too, with students in the UK around this kind of often like learning about climate change can feel really like unrelatable to what people actually care about and what matters, and often there's a focus on the problems but not on solutions, and particularly like, you know, what do you actually care about, what do you enjoy, and like how can you connect climate action into that. So I think that kind of disconnect is really powerful, and a lot of the people in our research talked about denial and disengagement with climate change. And so yeah, I think that's something which is a very shared experience. Yeah, when it comes to monitoring, this is something which is a really big question in the climate mental health space at the moment, because it can be really hard. And I think mental health can sometimes maybe feel less kind of like tangible, and like it's harder to measure sometimes. There are really big data gaps for mental health generally. But in the UK, but in lots of countries, so it makes it kind of harder to kind of create ways to measure it, which kind of can kind of feel like it's actually really capturing impacts kind of broadly. It's not just measuring like small parts where we have data. And so I think kind of what we can do is kind of looking across different like seeing what does exist in terms of what data is being collected, like what is there that can be then used to track this. But I think a really important part of that is just finding out like what matters, and what do whether if it's with young people, like what do young people want to see reflected in the data that gets collected, like what matters to them in terms of the experiences that they are holding or the action they want to see. And I think that has to be where our kind of ways of measuring has to come from, is firstly that like listening to what is important. But there is also a lot of work that is happening now to try and build these kind of ways of measuring. And I think that also means kind of getting people across different fields and different sectors to like work together on seeing what's out there already, what can we use, and then how do we create new things which actually really reflects what people care about and what they're experiencing. Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's see a couple of so lots of people talking about hearing about eco-anxiety, anxiety about the future. Yeah, it's a really important point about negotiators experiencing a lot of stress, and this is something which I've heard a lot as well around just how it feels to be working in these kind of climate action spaces, but then holding the kind of stress and responsibility and guilt and all of the emotions that comes with the action not happening in the way it needs to. So yeah, sorry.
Thank you for the insight. I've got a question regarding the data when talking about mental health and advertising. So specifically, when you were talking about the suicide rates, for example, increasing high, I just wanted to ask, how does when trying to quantify that, in a sense, how does one? I apologize, it's meant to be disrespectful. I'm not trying to be. But in extreme vulnerable societies, let's say there's a flood, etc., how does one kind of create is the link as obvious as increase in drought impacts farmland, food, which leads to stress and then therefore depression? What's the kind of like thinking and the linkage, if you could explain?
No, it's a great question. Yeah, definitely. I think it can be really hard to work out those pathways of impacts. Like it can be kind of a lot of the kind of initial research in this space looked at like, oh, there's an association between extreme heat and then suicide rates, or drought or flooding, or but actually really kind of unpacking what that means in terms of those pathways is something which came out a lot in the project Connecting Climate Minds, which was these kind of dialogues, was trying to kind of understand more of those pathways. And it can be like some of that might be biological. So for example, with extreme heat, people who are using like a lot of the medications that are used to treat mental health conditions like schizophrenia, these medications can interfere with the body's ability to regulate temperature. So there can be kind of biological reasons that make people more vulnerable. But it can also, livelihoods and kind of economic impacts is a really important part of this. It can be things like a lot of people in our Connecting Climate Minds project talked about kind of social and cultural disruptions as well, like being forced to migrate, not being able to get to school, and I think kind of climate change is it's kind of a worsening factor for many of the things which are already driving poor mental health and well-being in all communities and vulnerable communities. So it's kind of seeing where it's like a kind of a worsening factor is really important in the data. And the data with suicides is one where often that data isn't collected in many parts of the world, and a lot of the data is being missed. But it can be one where, in places where that data is being collected, it can be like quite a practical measure because you're measuring deaths. But a lot of other impacts can be much harder. So yeah, it's a complex picture, but I think your point around like this is actually really there are many different pathways that are happening at play is really important. Yeah. That's your question.
I suppose the main link to with the rise of industrialization and like the lack of, I suppose, human consciousness, right? And the higher dimension which we are able to recognize that we are part of a collective and always simple more like a spiritual kind of outlook, because this really, I think it really shows that can give that sense of hope or I guess, yeah, really anxiety, just because I mean, just 2 weeks back, I started the job with every addiction of the alternative because that, the things about profiles for communicating climate change and actually my current boss was left burnout. And it's interesting because, yeah, I mean, through that, there's like the change, right? In the narrative that, these accounts are trying to put out there. And I think that's a high responsibility, right? From the individual to communicate more like fall in love with the next world rather than just sharing feelings of
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that that's really important, and that kind of collective versus individual. And I think that's when we frame climate change as an individual responsibility, it's so harmful, and that it has to be framed in that real kind of collective way. And I think there's there can be we can often I think we're living in this society which does really individualize not only climate action but also mental health and well-being. I think that that kind of separation is driving both a mental health crisis but also a climate crisis. And there's so much power in collective action. That's collective climate action because not only is really impactful for driving change, but also it builds those kind of connections and the social kind of relationships and communities that are so important for good mental health and for well-being collectively as well. So yeah, I think that is a really important part of this. And I think like to your point about the kind of education spaces as well, and how it can feel like a lot of the research that we've been doing together with young people, we've talked about how feeling these kind of often like polarization and how different social media narratives and different kind of ways of talking about this comes into driving a lot of disconnection. I think is a really big challenge at the moment. So thank you.
Because I don't want to come across as ignorant, and I'm framing this question as I go. So you mentioned at some point that a lot of the research on climate change and mental health is very Eurocentric, and it also helps that European nations tend to be more developed than the global south. So data gaps are likely to not be as pressing of an issue as if we were to conduct a study in developing countries. Now, in developed countries, there can be a focus on mental health as opposed to developing countries, because if we go by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, developing countries, the layman is more concerned with how climate change affects their immediate physical needs, because these are also the places where climate change affects them the most. So how do we bridge that gap between, I think Peter had brought this up just now, from this generalized distress to an awareness of what is causing the distress to collective action? How would we communicate the necessity of that with regards to mental health to the layman in developing countries?
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a really important question, and I think partly it comes down to language as well, around like a lot of the language that is being used to talk about these concepts, like they don't always translate across different languages, or they don't always resonate with what people are experiencing in different communities. So for both climate change, but also for mental health and for wellbeing. And like in this Connecting Climate Minds project, when we're talking about mental health, a lot of the people who were part of these dialogues are saying, like, this doesn't make sense to me, because we don't have individual mental health in my community, we have collective mental health, and so this, like, I don't know how to like make sense of this. So I think the kind of the language that gets used, there's a lot of work that maybe is needed globally around kind of how we create kind of words that actually matter and resonate. You talked about data gaps. I think we've been doing a research project with some people in the Philippines at the moment, and something which is often like a real challenge in kind of gathering data is that research project has been delayed multiple times because the research team are responding to typhoons that they're dealing with every day. So this is very present in the lives of researchers, not only the people they're doing the research with, and that's really kind of perpetuating these evidence gaps. And I think on point around these kind of feelings of anxiety and distress, a lot of the kind of data that has been done across different countries shows that it's the people who are most exposed to climate impacts who have the highest levels of climate anxiety and the highest levels of distress. And so the kind of links between climate anxiety with what it means to be experiencing and responding to these impacts in your day-to-day life, I think, is really important. We need more data in kind of more countries, absolutely. So that kind of two questions. Thank you.
Yes, or because I know some of the indicators like are known to company work done. So it's going to like what people do that. Because I remember before the city, in some of the developing countries of Latin America, we're discussing like, do we have the information to report this? And the information was low, but it was politically very important, and it was like that it was key. But there's like no actual indicators right now on how to measure it. And a lot of capacity building and support to the lab will be necessary, but I would like to maybe have some ideas during the research that you have done. There has come up like efficient and politically like feasible options to like finance these kind of indicators.
Yeah, thank you. It's so the global goal on adaptation process was for a bit of context, was a really important like part of the COP30 agenda to reach agreement on what these indicators should be and what countries should be measuring. And there was a lot of work that happened in the years before COP around what those indicators should be, like what is actually practical to measure, as you say. And then during the COP process, kind of that experience of trying to like bring together the different perspectives of so many different countries ended up with a shortened list of these indicators, which are kind of exist across different sectors and ways to track how adaptation action is happening. And in the case of the mental health one, the kind of where they've got to on the indicator is something that is quite hard to measure because it's quite vague. So it's like, I think the wording is, the proportion of vulnerable people who have access to mental health and psychosocial support in the context of disasters. and like what is meant by vulnerable, like everyone can be vulnerable to climate change, and so kind of finding ways to then put that into practice, I think is like the next challenge. And so I think that's the process that's now starting now to then kind of see where data does exist, like how to then be kind of revising these indicators to then really match like what data is out there. So with the mental health one, for example, there is data that the World Health Organization collects, which looks at I think it's like the like how many countries are providing mental health and psychosocial support in the context of disasters, and so they, where is the data already that then can be tracked. So yes, I think it's like they have a couple of years now is the next part of the process to then like put these indicators into practice. But I think the fact that there is one for mental health feels really promising, and they went from this really long list of like over 100 indicators down to 50 indicators, and mental health is still in there, so that feels positive. But yeah, I think that kind of making it like practical, and actually how to then kind of measure this over time is going to be I think it's like a whole nother work program that started to try and do that. So yeah, that's all I know so far at the moment. But yeah, thank you.
I don't know, get past this, like, being
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of the students and the teachers that I've been working with in this research project have talked about but really connection and feeling this, like at the moment climate education can feel quite disconnected from young people's lives and what they care about, and also from solutions, and it's just kind of talking about the problems. So a lot of the ideas that they had about what they would want to see happen to transform education were like building more connection to nature was really important, and making sure that there's kind of learning happening outside the classroom and building in kind of spaces outside and being in nature. Obviously that's not something that's possible for every school, so there's kind of a lot of also challenges around what kinds of action are accessible. But yeah, that was like a really important one. But a lot of it was around just having opportunities to talk about, when you're talking about the challenges of climate change, also to talk about the actions that are happening, and to create space for exploring different emotional responses. And a lot of the educators kind of said that they could feel like they worried bringing up climate change might induce feelings of distress, or like, what would it mean to then be talking about this stuff in the classroom. I think there's a real need for support for teachers on how to be talking to children about this, and young people in ways that can create the space to also like reflect and process on the different feelings that can come up when learning about it, and also kind of putting it into more subjects. I think at the moment people learn about, I don't think I learned about climate change at all when I was in school, but often it's in science or it's in geography, but it's not in every subject. So a lot of what we also heard from students was like, oh well, if I'm not studying science or geography, climate change isn't something that is relevant to me, so why should I engage with it? So I think making it feel really relevant and really connected to what young people experience and what they care about is a really important part of it, and kind of focusing on how can we kind of together like imagine the world that we want to be part of, and then supporting through education for students to see like, okay, I really care about art, or I really care about music, and how can that have a role in creating that world? So yeah, this kind of moving from disconnection more into connection is what we really heard. But yeah, I think it can feel really hard for teachers to do that.
Natural disasters and developments in research and
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a great question. I think there's been a fair bit of research around pregnancy and air pollution and how air pollution can impact both kind of maternal health, but also like child's health. A lot of the kind of experiences that I've heard around women's health in the context of climate change have talked about how well, often about kind of gender-based violence and how the experiencing extreme heat, experiencing extreme weather events can be a kind of compounding factor driving higher rates of gender-based violence. I don't know that much about pregnancy and extreme weather events in terms of data, but a lot of women in our Connecting Climate Minds project talked about kind of feeling kind of huge kind of mental health impacts of the kind of stress and grief and fear around kind of disproportionately holding caregiving responsibilities, often in the context of like smallholder farming. I talked about this being a group who can be kind of particularly at risk of poor mental health in the context of climate change. Smallholder farmers are disproportionately women. And it's often again, it's just like, all of the things which can make women and girls more vulnerable anyway to poor physical and mental health are made worse by climate change. But there is also kind of a lot of evidence that shows when you have more women in positions of power when it comes to climate action is better, the policy outcomes are better, more women are involved in climate activism, working in climate change careers. So I think it's important to not just be looking at the kind of vulnerabilities that certain groups like women and girls experience, but also what are the resiliencies and what are the kind of knowledge and skills and tools that are held by women that need to be really put at the like heart of climate action to so it's like both resilience but also vulnerability. But yeah, it's a good question about pregnancy beyond air pollution. I don't know very much. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you spending your Thursday evening listening to this and being such an active part of it. Thank you. And if you're interested in any of the stuff that's happening at Oxford in terms of climate and mental health, let me know. We're doing kind of ongoing research policy work, and we'd love to hear from anyone who wants to get involved.
Thanks so much, guys.
For speaking, and thank you everyone. Just a bit of housekeeping. Two things. Firstly, if you've signed up for Capstone project, you should have now received emails by HT2026. If you have not yet received an email, we'll give you a reason for it. You're one of the last two groups who is still slightly short numbers, so we're going to be doing time reshuffling, or you haven't filled out form to go through yet, in which case please can you find it again in the chat. We have pizza for the Pizza Social. It's going to be arriving ASAP, but it will be about 10 minutes or so. So if you guys are happy to stick around and just chat for a little bit and wait for that, that would be absolutely wonderful. Really as many you say as possible.